Okay, we're going to be looking at reworking this system to ensure that it meets NEC. The first thing I did was reposition this interconnecting box for the class 2 wiring. The next thing I did was add an LFMC conduit section in here. So basically, for code purposes, this non-listed box disappears. We also have a hole for our class 2 cable. Now our class 2 cable will feed through this hole and it will be bushed, or I will take some sandpaper and make sure that the wire is protected against abrasion. This is important. I also had to add another hole to bring a ground wire in from the power wiring section, because 725.9 states that if I'm using any metallic boxes or anything like that, grounding rules apply. The grounding rules of 250 apply for boxes and fittings for class 2 wiring. 3.314.17 also states that all wiring entering and leaving boxes and fittings will be protected against abrasion. So when I bring my ground wire in, I'm going to use a close nipple. This side is fluted. This side is not. This side is going to require a bushing. Why? Well, as previously stated, 314.17 says wiring shall be protected against abrasion. If you are using RNC, which is a shocker, rigid non-metallic conduit, or rigid or IMC, a bushing is required. It is stated that a bushing is required. You can use one of these. You can use a bushing that threads on to the threads if construction allows it. If you're knocking out a hole in a metal box to bring your class 2 in, you're going to need an insulated bushing to protect it from abrasion at the knockout hole. And the code also allows you to use tubing that protrudes at least 1/4 inch past the last fitting into a box. This happens to be a piece of 3 conductor 14 gauge NM jacket. That should be suitable, although of course they make split tubing as well. Now our class 2 wire is going to enter through this hole. You will note that there are no voltage ratings on the wire. It does, however, say that it is 3-pair 24 gauge. This particular one, the one I'm going to be using, is 3-pair 22 gauge. And that makes it too small to reclassify it, and we'll talk about that later, because there is a trick that I could have pulled had this been a listed enclosure, and it is not, to actually bring the control wiring to the luminaire through the power wiring conduit. But we can't pull that trick because this isn't a listed enclosure, but we'll discuss it in a further segment. Now, when I bring my class 2 control wiring out, I'll be able to attach it to the LFMC that I'm using to provide power to the lamp, despite the fact that Article 725.58 forbids me strapping it to the conduit. They also refer me to 300.11b2. And by the way, I'm using a 2002 code book, and most of this language is new to the 2002 code book. 300.11b2 says, where the raceway contains power supply conductors for electrically controlled equipment and is used to support class 2 circuit conductors or cables, that are solely for the purpose of connection to the equipment control circuits. In other words, I can strap my control cable to this conduit that I'm going to put here because it is part of the control of the function of that powered device. Complicated, no? I told you this was a complicated section. The most common question I get, being in lighting, is can I run my control cables with my power cables in the same raceway? It's very convenient to do that because you had to run a raceway for the power wiring, and it would just be lovely to pull your control cables through that same raceway. Well, it's a little trickier than it sounds, but before we go on, let's talk a little more about reworking and bushings. If you're going to plug a hole in, say, a watertight box, you need to use an approved plug that came with it. You cannot use a metal plug on a plastic box. You got to go get one of those expensive ones. There is a fancy method to plug a hole in a plastic box with a metal barrier, but you're probably just going to need to go and buy an expensive plug. Another good question is, how does the code treat this interconnecting box? It's class 2. It's supplied by the manufacturer to go with this cable, so we're going to have to assume it's okay. 725.52 Bravo, exception 2, states that other methods and materials can be used to extend or replace class 2 wiring. That's a big exception, and it sends you on a merry chase through the code, but so far as I can tell, the manufacturer has this listed for use. This is a listed class 2 cable. No voltage rating, as that is forbidden by 725.71 to put it on the cable. That's because they're afraid that people will see a voltage rating on the class 2 cable and try and use it power utilization equipment with a power supply branch. But bear in mind that despite the fact that it's not marked, as this is a listed class 2 cable assembly, it has to have an insulation rating of at least 150 volts minimum. I'll be attaching it once again to this raceway and taking it out to the box where I bring in the wiring to the luminaire. But what about inside that box? 725.55D Associated Systems, and number 1 under that states, if I can find it, Class 2 circuit conductors in compartments, enclosures, similar fittings shall be permitted to be installed with electric light power circuits where they are introduced solely to connect the equipment connected to Class 2 circuits, where 1 or 2 applies, and 1 is the electric light conductors are routed to maintain a minimum of 6 millimeters, 1/4 inch separation from the conductors and cables of Class 2 circuits. So this guy, when I get it out to the luminaire, cannot approach the power wiring within 1/4 inch inside the enclosure that's used to route the wiring into the luminaire. So in order to assure that's not going to happen, I'll not only route it, but I'll use a physical barrier to ensure that these wires remain separated, the power and the Class 2, by at least 1/4 inch, and voila, we have met code. Now, had this been a listed enclosure, there's a trick I could use to actually take the Class 2 in through this conduit, and we'll discuss that later. Now's a good time to have a few 5-minute discussions on Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, and power branch circuits.